Hey guys, what's up? It's Collegio. Today I want to talk about the federal government shutdown. Democrats are saying the Republicans are being irresponsible with the nation's social and healthcare priorities, while Republicans are saying the Democrats are a bunch of tax and spend progressives who don't care about the nation's fiscal health. The truth is complex, reality is complex, and I'm going to give an ultra-realist take on what's going on, as well as some history of government shutdowns. There's a lot there, it might surprise you. And I'm also going to kind of zoom out and try to give a sense for what this means with the fiscal crisis that we're going to be, focused on over the next 5 to 10 years. But first, I do want to get into some history and also kind of an explanation of what's going on with regard to why the government is shutting down. So in order for the federal government to operate, for an employee to get paid, two types of laws have to be passed. There has to be an authorization law to authorize the government to do something, and then there has to be a funding mechanism in order to pay for the government to do what it's authorized to do. First is called an authorization law. The second is called an appropriations law. And what happens in a government shutdown, it usually happens at the end of the fiscal year, this last fiscal year ending on September 30th. It has to do with the two parties, the Congress and the president, not agreeing on what those spending levels should be. They play a game of chicken, and then before you know it, there's no spending bill to appropriate to the agencies to do their work, and the government shuts down. So that's what's happening mechanically. What's interesting is that this is a relatively new phenomenon politically, but there are some interesting parallels of what's happened in the past. I want to get into this. So the first government shutdown in recent history, modern history, happened in 1980, but we have had periods of extreme partisanship in the United States where things have happened like this. So I want to go back to the time of the Civil War. In the aftermath of the Civil War, that really wasn't the end of the conflict between the North and the South. While they weren't fighting with, bayonets and muskets, they were fighting in Congress over laws and, different regulations that were going on. And this kind of came to a head in 1890. There was a period of time where the Republicans were in control of the House and the Democrats refused to speak. All right, they kept silent. And what that meant is that the Republicans in the House were not able to get a quorum, or kind of like a baseline minimum number of votes, in order to conduct any business in the House. This was called the Reed Rules controversy of 1890 and 1891. They effectively shut down the U.S. House of Representatives for about 8 days, but the spillover effects lasted over a month because they really couldn't get any business done in the U.S. House of Representatives until that was cleared. Now, while that was not a real government shutdown, that didn't actually impact anything that the federal government was doing, it is a case where partisan politics really got in the way of getting things done in Washington, D.C. for the people. There were irreconcilable differences between the Northern Republicans and the Southern Democrats. They couldn't get past them, and they just shut down Congress. All right. Now, the first government shutdown that involved, not paying federal workers happened in 1980 at the end of the presidency of Jimmy Carter. At issue was a federal agency called the Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC, as you might have heard of it. It's an agency that regulates business and kind of business practices. Now, the regulator was a relatively new agency, and the regulators at the FTC in the Carter administration had just kind of gotten really, really aggressive, to the point where even Democrats were kind of uncomfortable with what they were trying to do. There was a question as to how much they were going to fund this agency, and for a day in 1980, it did not get any funding. Now, it only impacted one agency, and it only impacted about 1,000 employees, but it was the first government shutdown in modern history. Now, there were 3 other similar cases to this happening in the 1980s under President Reagan. One of them happened for about a day. One of them and 2 of them happened for about 4 hours. So they're kind of lost to history because while the government did technically shut down, when it happens for less than a day, it doesn't really matter. People still get paid. Now, the first multi-day federal government shutdown was in 1990. And at issue there was the Republican president, George H.W. Bush, had just cut a deal with congressional Democrats to raise taxes. Now, Republicans don't like raising taxes. He did it, and it caused a little micro revolt among House Republicans, specifically House Minority Whip Newt Gingrich. And for 3 days, they shut down the government over this tax increase. Now, what's interesting about it is that they shut the government down on a Friday and they opened it back up on a Monday. So the government was shut for 3 days, but because it happened over the weekend and most federal government employees don't work on the weekends, nobody really felt it. It was felt by something like 60 or 70,000 employees, and it actually remains an incident that's kind of lost to history. I'd almost totally forgotten that had happened, because the real mark of a federal government shutdown happened in 1995 and 1996. This is kind of like when we talk about government shutdowns and the political volatility of them. These 2 episodes are really what caused that. Now, at issue here was President Clinton had been elected in 1992 as kind of like a conservative third-way Democrat. But he didn't govern that way. The first 2 years were fairly liberal. He promoted a universal health care plan. He raise taxes. And voters responded by electing a huge majority of Republicans in 1994. It was like the biggest Republican majority in about 100 years. And Republicans, feeling the wind at their back, overreached. And they decided that they were really going to press into spending cuts. And at the end of the fiscal year, in September 30th, they started not being able to get to an agreement on what the spending levels should look like. By the end of the fall, they had shut down the government for about a week. They moved back to a continuing resolution to continue funding the government at previous levels until they could cut a deal. And then at the end of 1995, they ended up shutting down the government for more than a month. And it was politically catastrophic. The Republican Party had approval ratings over the 40s and the 50% level range. And after the government shutdown of 1995, their approval rating was down in the 20s or lower. It was a catastrophic defeat for the Republicans. They ended up, people thought that they were going to win the presidency in 1996. Those hopes were dashed. And, Newt Gingrich flew too close to the sun and he just kind of melted. And it was more or less, while he stuck around for another couple of years, it was almost the end of his political career, because his judgment to shut down the government, that the idea that people would come and support him, was just dramatically long. And it actually stained many Republican politicians and policymakers, because that experience was like traumatic and nobody wanted to go through it again. So government shutdowns for the GOP were kind of an unspoken thing. Like, we're never going to do that, but until 2013. Again, President Obama became president, and Republicans had won a huge number of seats in the 2010 elections, but they lost the presidential election in 2012. And they went to battle with President Obama over spending cuts. President Obama didn't budge. They reverted to continuing funding resolutions. Everybody thought that the same thing was going to happen in 2013 to the Republicans that happened to Gingrich in 1995, but it didn't. It was interesting. Republicans actually picked up huge number of seats in the Senate. They also, I believe, picked up some seats in the House. And it didn't have the political impact that everyone had thought. Fast forward another few years, suddenly Donald Trump is in the position of being president. He wants something that the Democrats won't give him, which is funding for the border wall. They won't do it. They have a standoff for a number of days and the government is shut down. Democrats ended up winning seats, but the country is so polarized at that point that everyone kind of forgot about that episode. And it didn't really make a huge dent in 2020 because COVID and George Floyd and all these new sets of issues has kind of just completely displaced the government shutdown in voters' minds. So fast forward, it's 2025. What's going on? Well, in 2010, when they passed the Obamacare law, there were a number of subsidies that were designed to help people buy insurances from private health insurance companies. All right. In 2021, during the COVID years, Congress and the president expanded those credits because of what was going on with COVID, but they didn't do it permanently. They did it temporarily. And the expanded Obamacare tax credits are ending at the end of this last fiscal year, which was September 30th. Democrats are saying we are not funding the government unless we keep those expanded tax credits in place. Republicans are saying they were never meant to be a permanent fixture. If you wanted to be a permanent fixture, you should have made it a permanent fixture. They're expiring. It was a COVID level thing, and we need to get spending under control. We're not doing this. And the parties are at a standoff, and the government has been closed now for about 15 days. So what does all of this mean kind of like on the ground, and what does it mean both politically, and then kind of what does it mean for the United States? That's really what I want to get into. I would say that at the micro level for the employees, it sucks. Right? Like, they're not able to go into work, all right? And their work is still happening. It's piling up on their desks, but they're not allowed to do any of the work. So if you're a federal employee right now, this really, really sucks. Now, if you're President Trump, do you care about that? Not so much. I believe that what's going on in President Trump's mind is that I think he believes that most federal government employees are Democrats. They're not going to vote for him anyway, so he doesn't really care. I think the other thing that's going on is President Trump this is it. He's not running for re-election. That doesn't look like it. And I think he's just kind of made the determination that this might be an opportunity to cut spending. One of the things that he's been doing is he's been floating the idea that these government employees that are currently furloughed are not going to get back pay. They've always gotten back pay. And I think that he might be playing this card of saying, hey, Democrats, if you really want to get these people paid, I'm not going to pay them unless you end this government shutdown. All right. I think he might feel like he has a little bit of leverage there. I also think, quite honestly, he may not even care as to whether or not those employees get paid. Politically, what does it mean? I don't know that it means the same as it did in the 1990s or even 2013. The parties are so polarized that if you're a Democrat, you're blaming the shutdown on Trump, and if you're a Republican, you're blaming the shutdown on the Democrats. So I don't know that there are a lot of people in the middle who are really going to look at the data and say, well, you know, the Democrats really are to blame because they're demanding something that they didn't do in 2021. Like, I just don't know that how many people are like stripping away all the details and trying to come to a conclusion about this. I think if you don't like Trump, you're blaming it on Trump. And if you don't like the Democrats, you're blaming it on the Democrats. So politically, I'm not convinced, unless this thing, you know, lasts for 6 months, I'm not convinced that it's going to have a major impact politically. Where it is going to have a major impact, maybe not this year, I'm looking down 5 years, okay? Because this is a symptom of hyperpartisanship and where the two sides have just irreconcilable differences and they can't come to an agreement on what to do next. And where this is really problematic is when it comes to cutting whatever the big debt deal is going to be in the next 5 years. Okay, so for some reference, in 2024, the US government had a budget, spent about $7 trillion. It only brought in about $5 trillion in tax revenue, meaning that we had a budget deficit of $2 trillion, which is just this unfathomable amount of money. It's being funded mostly by investors and a lot of foreign governments who are basically using their trade imbalance surpluses to buy US debt assets, okay? They don't have to do that, and they may stop doing it if they believe that the United States is going to become insolvent and isn't able to pay those debts off, okay? So in the next 5 years, we're getting to the point where the amount of interest paid on the debt is going to start eclipsing all of the spending that we spend on the really big critical spending programs like Social Security and Medicare and the Defense Department, okay? We could get to the point where the federal government cannot pay its bills without devaluing the dollar. The only way to do it without devaluing the dollar is cutting some kind of a deal that's going to bring down spending and raise revenues. Raise taxes, cut spending. The only way to do both of those things is with a bipartisan deal. And what this, hiccup is telling me in 2025 in the government shutdown is it's going to be really, really, really hard to cut a deal in the next 5 years over the debt. And it could mean that in the case that they can't cut a deal, something doesn't change, we don't have a leadership change that'll actually allow people to cross party lines and sign something, it could mean that the dollar gets devalued. And I think that that's why you've seen this massive run in gold prices over the last 6 months. I think that investors are quickly coming to the conclusion that the only way out of this debt crisis is printing money, and that means that the only thing that's going to be valuable is not the dollar, but assets that can't be minted out of thin air like precious metals or maybe Bitcoin. So that's my ultra-realist take. It's not all that optimistic, but I do think it's ultra-realist, and I think it's a gritty take on what's really happening behind and above all the drama. So we'd love to know what you think. Drop a comment. We'd love to have you subscribe, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.